And now it's technical time with UL.
Hello and welcome to Technical Time with UL, where we talk about the ongoings of the window and door industry and how UL can help enable safety and sustainability of your products. My name's Ryan Harper and I'm your host for this session today. Joining me is Benjamin Holt, a senior account executive with our UL Environment and Sustainability team. How you doing, Ben?
Good, Ryan. Thanks for having me today.
No problem. So, Ben, you and I have had many conversations, and today more than ever, social and environmental sustainability is really good for business. There's a research report conducted by the Nielsen company that showed that 2/3 of global consumers are willing to pay more for products and services that come from companies that are committed to a positive social and environmental impact. The problem, though, is that the companies are finding that these environmental processes give them some key challenges in that they can't really effectively communicate that sustainability effort to their stakeholders and the public in general. So I wanted to get your opinion today, Ben, why are companies experiencing challenges in what we call green marketing?
That's a great question. And one of the main challenges we see is green product marketing, is anything but black and white. There are a growing number of eco-labels that has made it difficult to differentiate from a consumer perspective between products that are genuinely environmentally preferable and those that aren't.
So obviously we can support that initiatives. How do we help differentiate the good from the bad?
Great. So yeah, UL offers certifications that ensure that products live up to their environmental claims and are able to differentiate against those that are quote unquote greenwashing, which is a term that refers to products that make environmental claims without proof. So as an example, greenwashing claim could be something as simply as putting environmentally safe or 100% organic on the product or the website, brochures, whatever. These are blanket statements that don't have any supportive information that can be validated or verified.
So what's an example then of something that UL would validate against for the fenestration industry?
So some of the relevant claims that the fenestration industry focuses on or could focus on recycled content, meaning that the products are manufactured with materials that contain post-consumer recycled content. Mold resistance, which means that products are manufactured with materials that are resistant to developing mold. And probably the most common or popular claim would be zero waste to landfill, which is basically it's a claim that proves that a facility is consistently diverting materials to land or away from landfill.
Okay. So once a product has been taken their claim and it's been validated by UL, what can that fenestration manufacturer now do with that claim?
Sure. Once the claim has been validated, manufacturers are able to use the UL Green badge on their product packaging, marketing materials, website, etc. Basically, this badge communicates to customers and prospects that the products have been tested and or verified by a neutral third party and independently validated to have been manufactured and or performed in accordance with its specific environmental claim.
Great. Good information there. Thanks, Ben. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate having you.
Excellent. My pleasure.
And thanks to you for listening. To learn more about how environmental claim validations can help your product, please visit canada.ul.com/fencan, that's FENCAN, or you can email Benjamin directly at benjamin.holt@ul.com. Till next time, thank you very much and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another Fenestration Canada podcast.
This podcast is a presentation of Quanex Building Products. For more than 30 years, Super Spacer Tri-Seal from Quanex Building Products has been the ideal warm edge spacer solution for commercial and architectural glass. With its unique triple seal design, Tri-Seal provides structural strength, durability, and outstanding thermal performance in the most demanding applications. Learn more at quanex.com. This is Tech Talks, live conversations about the regulatory environment with Al Yagalis.
Okay, we're now live with Al Yagalis for Tech Talks episode 7 of this second season. So good afternoon, Al.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Steph. Good afternoon to our visitors. As noted in the invitation for our participants to join us today, we're looking at the topic of climate change in a sense that we're not really looking at climate change, but the need to mitigate climate change seems to be driving a global transformation of buildings, and fenestration products are definitely seen to be critically important to that transformation. Our guest this week is Rob Bernhardt, an advisor with Passive House Canada, who's been closely involved with both policy development and market transformation in Canada and internationally. Rob, welcome to Tech Talks. We're glad you could make some time today to be with us and to engage in conversation about low energy buildings, building codes, passive house, and related items. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Al. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you and also to speak with the fenestration industry within Canada. So thanks for the interest.
So, Rob, you've been involved with the Passive House movement for some time. Can you tell us what captured your imagination, how you came to yourself build a passive building, and maybe tell us what led to the creation of Passive House Canada?
Sure. Well, in my case, Al, it was actually entirely inadvertent. My wife and I had recently moved to Victoria. Our son, daughter-in-law, grandchildren were here. I was retiring, was the thought. And we decided after trying the community out, we'd like a house, and decided we'd build one. Then you start scanning around, well, what should it be? And our son was a general contractor, but not a house builder. And thought we looked at the different types of buildings or standards for buildings and came across Passive House, and it made a lot of sense. It's just sort of that science-based, outcome-focused, the comfort, the health, all those sorts of things. We couldn't, people of course said at that time it was too expensive, it can't be done, it doesn't work in Canada, all the things that you'll still hear sometimes to this day. But in looking at it, it didn't make any sense to us. So we thought, well, the heck with it. Let's just build one and figure it out. So I took the training because I was the only one with the time to do that. And there wasn't much training available back in those days. And we built one. And as we're building it, we thought, this really isn't that expensive. It does make a lot of sense. And we can't be the only ones that want to live in this kind of thing. So partway through the construction of our home, decided that really we should buy some lots and start developing and selling these. So we bought a small lot downtown Victoria and built the first market condo, just a 6-unit building, and put that on the market, and then went and bought some other lots and put that on the market, built them. So it turned into a bit of a business, but in the process, there was a growing interest in the building standard and an identified need to have a building standard association that could adequately represent the standard and help build capacity across the country. And I was asked if I would want to do that. I have a background in sort of leading and initiating organizations. So I agreed to do that and became the sort of initial CEO with a thought to build the organization up to the point where we could hire somebody else to fill that role. And we succeeded in doing that last year, just over a year ago. And we're lucky enough, after a fairly extensive search, to find Chris Ballard. He's our CEO at this point. And he brought quite a varied background with him as the president of the Public Affairs Association of Canada, and also in public life at the municipal level, sitting on city council, and then up to the province of Ontario under Kathleen Wynne. He was a member of cabinet for Premier Wynne. He was at one point the Minister of the Environment, at another point the Minister of Housing. So closely involved in the transformation in the Ontario market and working in that area. So he's taken over as CEO, and I've stepped back, just acting in an advisory capacity and helping out with a few specific projects and doing some writing. So that's kind of my story in the path.
So it sounds like it started as a retirement project to build a retirement home, and went on from there.
It got out of control.
So did you say that it was your son that was in construction?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, and so that's very interesting that it went from your own home to discovering a new way of doing this. Roughly when was that home built?
It was built in 2012 and then finished in 2013. So
okay, so and at that time, Passive House Canada didn't exist.
Did not exist.
Okay, so there was a lot of learning, from the ground up. Were there other Passive House organizations in Canada at the time?
Yeah, small there was, but they tended to be small. And what the practitioners wanted was an organization that would have a professional presence and a budget to support staff and be able to operate at a different level than what other organizations were offering. And also to be properly constituted, be member-based with proper governance and oversight and that type of thing. So it's not the hobby of a few people. And it's not a business, it's a proper sort of not-for-profit with a governance structure.
Right. So you've answered my next question already. In terms of what's your role in the organization today? So you're an advisor, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And what kinds of tasks? You've well, back to Chris's background. Sounds quite interesting that it involves operating at the government level. So does this? Do you know how a passive house is perceived? By government these days?
Well, government with the climate change imperative, government understands. Well, of course, government isn't homogenous, so I shouldn't say that government understands as though everyone in government understands.
Right.
So need to be careful there. But certainly at the international level, there's widespread recognition of the need to absolutely maximize building energy, operating energy efficiency in order to mitigate climate change. And you see all over the place countries and subnational jurisdictions implementing policies and building codes and so on that really incorporate the types of outcomes you get with passive house. So they may or may not call it passive house, but they're targeting those outcomes. Even in Bulgaria at the recent Passive House conference, there was a presentation on how their current building code today in Bulgaria compares to passive house. And the answer is it's not quite there, but it is way closer than we are.
Now, are building codes in Europe aligned in some ways with passive house levels of performance today?
I think that's probably too sweeping a statement, but They do have the EU, what's the acronym? The Building Performance Directive for Buildings, the energy. I've forgotten the acronym, I'm sorry, but they've got an EU-wide directive that all nations within the EU were to have building codes that provided for nearly zero buildings across the EU by this year. So that's what was in place. The term nearly zero was not defined, but it was recognized long ago that a passive house would qualify as a nearly zero building. So you'll see different nations, they're getting close or closer, and and some areas, like the region of Brussels, have simply adopted a passive house building code, essentially. They take those performance outcomes and they codify it. You don't need to
Right.
use the same software. You can do quality assurance in a different way, but they're targeting those outcomes and they call it passive house.
So it sounds like Canada is embarked on something similar. Is that not right? In terms of, the bigger picture, what's driving our codes and so on.
Absolutely. And certainly in working with those who were developing our national building strategy, the BC Energy Step Code, that kind of thing, the climate plans that are all around, you'll see that sort of thing. And it's probably, well, I know it's not a coincidence that the top level of performance in the BC Energy Step Code targets some of the same metrics that you see in the Passive House Standard. Same thing with the Toronto Green Standard. You've got those same metrics popping up again and again. And that's sort of the pattern you see in more and more jurisdictions.
Right. And to our listeners and viewers today, you're welcome to join us in asking questions of Chris Ballard as well. So you can, Steph, how can people communicate their questions to us?
So as usual, you use the Q&A button in Zoom. For those who are online on YouTube right now, you can use the chat function on YouTube. So we'll make sure we read that. And if you want to come in the call and directly talk with us, then you just raise your hand in the Zoom call, and we'll patch you into to our guest.
Thank you.
No problem.
So you came to Passive House, wanting to build a retirement home. You got involved. You built some other, passive buildings. Got experience in that area. But it looks like you've gone on to also have some impact on both national and international policy related to perhaps net zero construction levels. Can you tell us a bit about that evolution, the touch points there?
Yeah. Well, prior to getting involved in Passive House, I had a varied background and a good understanding of sort of policy and legal structures and so on. And before Canada, I'm just trying to think how to put this briefly. Before Canada was talking about developing the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, or a building strategy or anything like that, we had the opportunity to engage with a UN agency in developing the UN framework guidelines for energy efficiency standards in buildings. And we thought at the time, well, the nice thing about Canadians is they embarrass easily. So if there's a global norm, we'll be too embarrassed to not at least meet that. So if we could help, sort of contribute to the creation of a global norm, that would be a good thing. So we did that, and we engaged in that process. Ultimately, I ended up chairing the meeting that did sort of the bulk of the drafting of the current UN framework guidelines. And then it goes up through the food chain within the UN agencies and eventually becomes the thing. And then recently there's a proposal to revise them. Just in a September 20th meeting, there was unanimous approval of the group of experts to revise those guidelines. The difference isn't really in the level of performance that's being talked about, it's in the level of specificity that's applied. And now you'll see more metrics defined in these guidelines. But again, it's aligning with Passive House outcomes. And a lot of the metrics are very familiar to Passive House practitioners. So we did that. We did that. And then we've just been engaged in those circles and also with the IPCC. I moderated a panel at an IPCC conference, and that connected us with a number of the authors and leaders, authors of the IPCC assessment reports and leaders within that agency. That led to the publication of an academic paper that was published recently, giving sort of a global review of where the levels of performance that buildings are achieving and what's facilitating that. So there's been quite a lot of writing and policy involvement over the years.
So would it be safe to say that there, at least I gather from what I've read and from some earlier conversations with you that there seems to be a kind of a global consensus emerging that you might say the energy demand goals that were defined by Passive House, which some would say are somewhat arbitrary, because I think the sweet spot of that 15 kilowatt per square meter per year was determined at the state of construction in Germany in the 1980s. And it was the point at which you could eliminate a central heating system, and eliminate the need for space heating. And that could have dropped construction costs. So that became an economic sweet spot in one place and one time, but it has now been adopted as a kind of a achievable target in construction on a much larger scale than that. Would it be safe to say that that level of performance that Passive House defined is now being recognized globally, perhaps, as an achievable target?
It is, and you'll see it. That's why you see it in things like those UN framework guidelines and in other documents of a similar type. And you'll see it coming into countries. China, we'll perhaps have an opportunity to talk about China in more detail later, but it's doing the same thing. And as you see this happening around the world, that's what people are coming to. And there's the reason for it, from what I can see, is that the building standard arose out of an EU-funded academic research project when the EU was having an energy crisis.
Oh,
and so the EU wanted to know, how efficient should buildings be? And they retained a bunch of academics to look at studies and go and see these buildings and talk to people and figure this out. So they were actually asking those academics to identify the performance outcomes that we now need today because of climate change rather than because of an energy crisis. But it's actually designed to answer that question. And it's framed, as you alluded to, in terms of building physics. So it's the heat carrying capacity of air, for example, for the heating demand, heating load, actually the heating load. But that's where that comes from. And the other criteria that are particularly relevant to fenestration products come again from building physics. The inside surface temperature of the glazing should be warm enough that it doesn't create induced drafts. Well, I think most any engineer can tell you what that delta in temperature is, from room temperature to inside surface temperature. So that's how those metrics are developed. It's science-based and intended to bring an outcome. And one of the academics involved in that research decided that, well, this could actually be a building standard, and set about developing it. That was Dr. Feist.
Okay. The interesting thing is, wasn't he inspired, or these academics inspired somewhat, by the Saskatchewan House in Canada?
Absolutely. Canada was a leader at the time. And we were known for some of the excellent work we were doing in buildings. And the Saskatchewan Conservation House, as it was known, was a joint federal provincial building science research project in Saskatchewan. They developed the concept of a blower door test, and they had to, of course, create an instrument that would do it. Same with ventilation. They knew that mechanical ventilation would be required. They built up an HRV because they needed heat recovery. So they had to create these things that didn't exist, and then they built this home based on it. That home is still occupied, still operating. The building envelope functions much as it was designed to function in the 1970s.
So that's a very interesting history. And of course, I guess were you involved with the BC Energy Step Code process as well?
Yes, we participated in that process, sitting around the table developing that regulation.
So interest in Passive House building clearly is growing, not just in Canada, but internationally, to a greater or lesser extent. Evidently, as you're saying, it's being defined with people are sort of comfortable in adopting the energy use intensity metrics of passive house into building codes and things. So they're not just locking into the passive house methodology per se. But so there are changes coming of this kind. But even though interest in this is growing, and in some ways it's the leading edge of building science and architecture today, some people are finding this talk of change to be unsettling. Especially, for example, folks in the window industry, where why are we dealing with this European standard? Why don't we know how to design energy efficient windows in Canada? The actual energy modeling characteristics that NFRC uses are considered to be more precise in a technical sense than the ISO standards that are used in passive house. So, why are we using a foreign standard? Why is this capturing us? And I think some people are finding it to be a threat or unsettling. Can you comment on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Al. There's really two areas I'd answer to in that respect. First of all, as to why are we using a foreign standard? In my view, it's very simple. We dropped the ball. When we were doing Saskatchewan Conservation House, we had an R&D program. We were leaders. They came here, they studied this. They say, hey, this can really work. They take it away and they do it. And we cut our budgets. We just quit leading. And had we carried that, we had a head start. And had we carried on with the work we were doing, and remember the R2000 standard and how that was to move building codes forward and so on, we didn't follow through. And had we followed through, they might have been grousing about having to use North American standards. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect
we dropped the ball. So
I think we're having some trouble here.
Don't have to.
Just let Stefan figure out what the technical issue is.
I think we're back. Are you guys back?
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry about that.
I can hear.
We're all good.
Okay, good. Yep. Thank you. But yes, we absolutely don't need to be using foreign standards. The position that Passive House Canada takes is we should have our own Canadian ways to do it. We can tweak it to our needs. We, as a relatively small not-for-profit, can't do that. It takes, that's a bigger conversation. There's a real opportunity to do that in code development. What we're loyal to and what the consumers and the climate is loyal to are the outcomes. So as long as we're targeting appropriate outcomes, there's different tools that can be used to get there. And so that's the one thing. But Al, you also mentioned the change and the unease that comes with change. And that's, so apart from using standards that are used perhaps more in Europe, the other thing is that change typically makes many people uncomfortable. We're comfortable with what we have, but the reality is that we can't achieve the outcomes that are required without some change. So we can do some things with the local standards and terms, but there are some things we simply have to change. We can't achieve different outcomes by continuing to do what we've done before. But if we take a science-based and evidence-based approach, understanding the outcomes that are to be achieved, that approach identifies where we can keep doing what we were doing and where we do need to change. Change is inevitable. What's that?
If we zoom out to 10,000 feet,
yeah.
Looking at the big picture, this is part of one of the many things we need to do to address climate change. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And Canada's commitments under the Paris Accords, maybe you could connect that to our code process and what's driving the stringency of energy requirements in our codes today?
Sure. Well, everyone, I'm sure all of our listeners will have heard of the Paris Accord. Virtually every nation of the world has signed on to it. And it sets out a roadmap for nations to address climate change. The reality is that there is probably no country that's currently on track to do enough. The push is to accelerate the rate of adaptation so that we can start to effectively mitigate climate change. I shouldn't have used the word adaptation there because that's normally used in a different context for climate change, but be that as it may, that's the ultimate driver. And Canada signing on for that developed the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. That is a federal provincial agreement signed by the Prime Minister and the premiers of the provinces. So it's a huge accomplishment. Within it, it identified the need to do a number of things in our country, to decarbonize the economy and to improve energy efficiency. One of those things was buildings. So our national building strategy called Build Smart was developed. It is signed by the national and provincial energy ministers other than Saskatchewan. And so again, we have a federal provincial agreement that we are going to transform buildings across the country. And it's targeting not just the energy efficiency, but health and comfort and all these sorts of consumer benefits that come with these better buildings. And it maps it out in some detail. There's material on the different components and performance standards and that type of thing. In that document, they identify the lowest performing window by, I think it's 2030, if I've got the year right. You would probably know better than I, Al. Will have a U value of 0.8, I believe. So, again, that's sort of the lowest level of passive house performance window in the warmest Canadian climates. And so we see this coming, and the BC STEP Code actually was being developed before the National Building Strategy, but they're very much aligned. And within the National Building Strategy, one of the items is to develop new building codes, and that's been budgeted, and groups have been assigned that task. But also there's other incentive programs, there's other industry development programs. It's really a good integrated strategy that Build Smart describes.
So the interesting thing is with the BC STEP Code and the initiative to make the national code also a level-based or tiered code approach is that these are not specific to passive house. You don't have to follow the passive house path to achieve these code objectives, correct?
That's correct. And the passive house is a compliance path often, but I would assume that as we develop codes, there'll be no requirement to use the same process that's used for passive house certification. The laws of physics are going to dictate that the buildings are going to look, the wall assemblies, for example, are going to look a whole lot like passive house wall assemblies. The windows are going to look a whole lot like passive house windows, just because that's what the laws of physics require. And that because passive house doesn't say how a wall or a window is to look, it simply specifies the performance outcome. And then we rely on physics after that.
Right. So with buildings moving in this direction, there's been concern about the cost of construction. And the assumption has always been that to make something better in terms of energy, you're going to have to spend a lot more money. What I have found interesting, I took part in a passive house workshop about 6 weeks ago. Passive House Canada put on. It was a building codes workshop, and it compared the energy strategies of the national code versus, passive house and so on. But I was struck by oh my goodness. Sorry guys, having a senior moment. The thought just evaporating here. Um,
The cost?
Exactly. That the secret to a energy efficient design is not so much the cost of construction as it is the what you might call the pattern language of the building. By in other words, designing the building enclosure with the energy goal in mind, as opposed to saying, okay, I want a U-shaped house, and I want it to face south, or this or that. And now I'm going to try to make it super energy efficient. Well, maybe if the house had a different shape, you know what I mean? You could make it energy efficient without spending much money. And it seems to me that even when it comes to the idea of a more energy efficient window, it's less a case of it being more expensive to manufacture than it is about redesigning it, the existing components that you already have, to maximize something like the energy performance. So I don't know if you want to comment on that if you approach the design with energy efficiency in mind, you can make design choices that lead to much better energy outcomes without fundamentally spending more money, or not a lot more money. Can you comment on that?
That's exactly right, Al. And you're capturing really the essence of high performance, and why, when you look at the actual data from projects that have been built, the difference in cost between passive house and other levels of performance, including much lower levels of performance, is too small to measure in most samples. Where people become concerned about the cost is when they take a look at a design, and it wouldn't matter if it's a window design or a building design, and they try to make an inherently inefficient design highly efficient. That is always, or almost always, a very expensive process. If you've got a building designed and you try to fix that up and make it perform at this level, very few people can afford that exercise. So, and that's what a lot of the costing studies will do, the theoretical costing studies. They start with a design, and then they see how much they need to add to make it efficient. And with an inefficient design, you just can't add enough no matter how much money you got. So it's been interesting watching people come across this. Certainly we saw with the early projects I was doing, there was some incremental cost bump, but it was, started out 4 or 5%, I think, with our first project, and went down somewhat from there. But so it was very small. And talking to the University of Toronto, they're building, I think it's a 780 bed student residence with a huge commercial kitchen, cafeteria, and so on. Right now, it's under construction. And their costing just prior to construction was that the bump for going from the minimum they could build to on their campus, which is somewhat above base code, but going from that to passive house was a 1% bump. And
in actual construction costs.
In actual construction costs. This is their first try at this. This is their first passive house project. They're experiencing about a 1% bump. And the individual I was speaking with from the university was saying that the biggest learning experience for them is that doing a passive house, or doing, a high performance building, it's not additive, it's different. So you don't take whatever you might otherwise do and add to it. You figure out a way to make efficiency affordable. And there's data sets now that are really showing this. And certainly you can spend lots of money. You can spend lots of money making a building a passive house if you want. It's a free world. But if you try to correlate building efficiency with cost per square foot, you put those two factors on a graph. I defy anyone to come up with a data set that demonstrates a correlation. There's so many factors that go into cost, many of which are of far greater impact than energy efficiency. And by the time you put it on a graph like that, the correlation just evaporates. It's not to say it costs nothing, but there's trade-offs. And as you were saying, you put in the better windows and you can perhaps limit the mechanical system. If you put external shading over those windows, the cooling loads go down, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. So these are, really interesting, really interesting things that I think not everyone appreciates about this. And again, this isn't just, I guess we're talking today about passive house, but really the same principles apply whether you're designing a net zero home or, to some other standard. But if you're designing to a performance outcome, if you choose to, you can intentionally design that in a way that is cost effective.
Yes.
And instead of taking an inefficient design and trying to add something to it. So I think that's a really important learning. If we just do we have any questions, Steph, from our viewers today?
Not that I see right now, so
Okay.
we can just remind them that they're welcome to join the
Sure.
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are, where do you see the greatest interest and activity in passive house buildings in Canada today, in terms of geographically, regionally, by province, however you would look at that?
I'm hesitating a little bit because there's been some older roots in a variety of places. We could maybe say Saskatchewan Conservation House is where it started, because that really is essentially a passive house. Prior in the build up to the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver and Whistler, Austria brought their team here, and they built a passive house for Austria House, for the sort of reception center for Austrian fans and team members and so on. And they built that there, and it's now a public building, a recreational building. But that gave a lot of people the opportunity to see it. And I remember at the time, because I was involved in the Olympics, hearing about the crazy Austrians coming over here and putting a building in Whistler with no furnace. And I was busy, I had no time. Those Austrians, man, oh man. And I never looked at that building until after the Olympics, oddly enough. And when we started to think what we might build for a house. And and then Vancouver has been a leader, and also BC as a province with the step code and so on was a leader. So there tended to be more in BC initially than in other parts of the country. And what we're seeing now is there's a significant pickup in Ontario, and the scale that's going on there it's really coming on. And then they're scattered across the country, beyond that. But, I would say right now, Vancouver, 20% of the rezoning applications in the city of Vancouver are for certified passive house buildings.
Really? That's amazing.
Market share. There's 5 high-rise towers on the books there. So so there's that happening. And then you see this number of projects in and around Southern Ontario is really considerable. And with some of the work that's going on, that we're in touch with various municipalities there, what they're planning and what they've got on the books as well. Toronto Community Housing alone has a multi-billion-dollar retrofit program that will involve them buying hundreds of thousands of windows that'll meet these standards. So, those sorts of things have the ability to really change the market.
I could imagine. Yes.
So we do have a question, Al, if
yes, please do.
Yep. So let me read it. It's from Sid. So he's saying, there is a U.S. passive house standard. Is that standard expected to be used in Canada, or is the Passive House Institute standard from Dr. Feist largely what Canada is adopting?
Shall I answer that?
Yes, please.
The Passive House Canada uses the international standard. There is the American one. I'm not familiar with all of the ins and outs of it, but the international one is really the one that's being picked up. When I was referring to the metrics being incorporated in various regulations picked up in various countries, those are the metrics that are being picked up from the international standard.
Okay.
As I understand it, but I'm no authority here. I was under the impression that Passive House US has the same high-level metrics, but maybe is more flexible on maybe using more in terms of North American methods to achieve them. But honestly, I can't speak to that. It's just what I believe I've heard. So
yeah, and it last I heard, they had different metrics for different climates.
For different climates. Okay.
Yeah. So
whereas the international standard has the same metric for all climates. Is that right?
Change the design to suit the climate rather than changing the target to suit a design.
I see. Okay.
And that may have been updated. But the other thing that, again, from the perspective of Passive House Canada, is we know the international level is achievable in all climates. There's, I don't know how many projects around. It's got to be pushing close to 100,000 now around the world. And that we would support anything that can achieve that level or better. That should be the outcome. And so it's just a matter of seeing that the outcomes are actually achieved in practice, that what's promised is what is delivered. So that really is a critical distinction with many other standards, where probably many people are familiar with the performance gap in buildings, where during the design phase, there's a certain level of performance. The approving authorities are told this building will be X% better than, and in the end, the performance just isn't what people are expecting. So that is really a crucial element that building standards going forward are going to have to address, is to ensure that the modeled performance during design lines up with the actual performance in operation.
We have another question from Sid. He's saying, you mentioned Austria. I know from our own dealings with Austrian companies that the Austrian government is now imposing net positive design of all government buildings. Is that a trend you see coming to Canada anytime soon? In BC, is the step code a precursor to this kind of thinking? Can you comment on that? I'm not sure what he means. Well, I'm assuming it means net positive energy generation or something.
Net positive good looks, I don't know. But, I certainly read about net positive buildings, and that typically is just meant to be a building that generates more energy on site than it consumes over the course of the year. It doesn't take into account seasonal variation and seasonal storage and so on. That's the typical definition. And certainly the higher levels of certification in Passive House are for smaller, like low-rise buildings, looking at net positive. And I don't know what the Austrian government is doing, but certainly some buildings are very capable of generating more energy on site than they actually consume. It becomes more challenging depending on the type of building and the density, for one, the high-rise building.
Yeah.
The technology for on-site generation, PV and so on, is always improving. What is impossible today is quite doable in 2 or 3 years from now. But that's the direction. The thought is that at the Passive House level of operating efficiency, it's possible you don't perhaps have every building that's net zero, but a community, a collection of buildings could be. And so that it's possible to have relatively localized, sustainability, self-sufficiency, I should say, in terms of energy performance.
So something you might have touched on, but I've heard that there's a lot of federal government funding available for deep energy retrofits of existing buildings, possibly to Passive House levels of performance. Is that true? And to your knowledge, and is it having any traction within the existing buildings market?
we know there's a lot of federal money that's going out in retrofits. They just recently announced another 2 billion, that's with a B, 2 billion for deep energy retrofits. The province of BC has a program. I know in that around Toronto, there's really detailed thinking going on as to how they're going to do this. I don't know that the level of performance they're targeting has been well defined yet. But there's a widespread recognition that the performance needs to be as good as it can be, whatever that is. The practitioners who are actually delivering buildings, these sort of deep energy retrofits, can all say, well, we did this, and they can say what the metrics are. But what's critical with existing buildings is to not lock in half measures, because the opportunity to do a deep energy retrofit on a building only occurs once or twice in the building's life cycle. And to waste the opportunity when it comes up is a huge loss, and it'll lock in the high emissions for decades to come. So it is probably unaffordable to go, say if a building's cladding is still good, to go and tear the cladding off and do the air tightness and the insulation under the cladding. Pretty much most people anyhow need to wait until the cladding needs to be replaced. And at that point, the incremental cost of doing the job well, doing the air tightness, doing the insulation, thermal bridges, dressing thermal bridges, that becomes much more affordable. And that's the time to do it. The thinking generally is if we have a retrofit rate of say 3% per year, that'll get us where we need to go. That is, if we retrofit, say, 3% of the buildings per year. So we're not looking at having to do every building in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But we can pick a time in the life cycle of a building where the opportunity exists to replace the mechanical system, to replace the windows, but do a good job when it's done, and install the windows in a way that when the insulation is added, they're in the right place within the envelope, and that they're installed in a way that'll accommodate the extra insulation, that sort of thing. So that's sometimes called a step-by-step, and it makes the achievement of these high levels of performance in existing buildings realistic in more circumstances.
So in other words, maximize each opportunity when it's cost effective to do so. In other words, if you're replacing a component, replace it with the best available, or in other words, like you say, it's when the cladding needs to be replaced that you can do then the significant upgrade to the thermal and air tightness performance of the walls and so on.
Exactly. And if you're going to do something, do it well. We can't afford to just pay everybody enough money to go and fix their buildings right away. So it's timing and opportunity. Some buildings will be replaced. They don't need retrofitting. They're going to be replaced. So that's a reality as well.
So another initiative you were involved with is the ZEBEX here in Vancouver, the Vancouver Zero Emissions Building Exchange. It's now 2 years old. I was reading about it. It claims to have engaged over 3,000 industry participants and organized 75 programming events in that 2-year period, and claims to be Canada's first center of excellence for high performance buildings. Can you tell us more about that and what it's intended to do and how it's doing from your point of view?
Yes, the city of Vancouver, as part of their zero emissions building plan, wanted to establish such a center in their city, and they did it. That's one of the reasons they've been able to lead as they have with the rollout of these high performance zero emissions buildings. And so Passive House Canada, in partnership with the Vancouver Regional Construction Association that acted as the host, and Open, or it used to be called the Open Green Building Society, but another not-for-profit group that's active in this space, got together and submitted a proposal to the city to operate that center, and we've been doing so since. It's really thought just to be an area that can support the capacity building within industry. And it's not so much a physical center as a knowledge hub. And at the moment, certainly it's very, very virtual, but as most things are. But a great way to disseminate knowledge, to support project tours so people in industry can see how these things are designed and built and rolled out. Listen to speakers, again, industry teaching industry, and learn from the best experiences. Connect with what's happening in New York and listen to somebody there that's been doing a high-rise there and the problems they've run into. That type of thing. Perhaps see the latest in equipment and windows and other technology that may be available. So it's really been that capacity building hub. We think it's a very effective model when it's well done. We are actually in the process of developing a concept for a similar type of center in Metro Toronto. So,
Oh, really? Tell us about that.
well, it's an initiative. We've been funded by the Atmospheric Fund in Toronto to develop a concept. We have a number of local governments and agencies like Waterfront Toronto, Toronto Community Housing, and that are interested in having something like this and having broad-based capacity in the region. And then we have engaged with, I think, about 30 odd sort of mostly industry associations, local governments, that sort of thing, in gauging their level of interest in such a center, what they could contribute or how such a center might help them. And we're just sort of putting all of that together now. We have reams and reams of comments and feedback. And right now we're distilling that into a more readable format. So, we think just as in Vancouver, it could be effective in the Southern Ontario market as well.
So these are centers of excellence for information sharing, collaboration, learning about best practices, inspiration, you might say, to people who are, wanting to explore this area and learning from those who have led the way, I suppose, that kind of a thing.
Absolutely. And a clearinghouse for courses and that type of thing. A lot of industry associations offer education, and where it's relevant to zero emissions buildings, then that would be something that the hub could help promote.
I see. Yeah. And the approaches are not limited to passive house, I understand. Is that right?
No. But again, the recognition is that half measures won't get us where we need to be. Right. So stepped approach is common. I'm sure it will be implemented. And it's certainly planned to be implemented by the policies that are out there. So we don't go from our base building code today to passive house. Most people don't in one step. The leaders do, but the average industry doesn't. So these centers will support different levels of performance, but the leadership will recognize where we need to get to in the end and how much time we have to get there.
Right. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the national and BC building codes. I understand that you've had some concern about the 2020 code process. Maybe you could share your thoughts on that for a few minutes.
Sure. The concern actually is a little bit broader than just the 2020 code process. And it really, our building codes and much of our regulatory system is set up to set sort of a floor. This is the bare minimum that anybody can do. And they're developed on a very broad-based consensus basis with a wide variety of interests being at the table, including a large number of interests who would rather not change anything. Their business model is based on what we currently do. So that environment, especially when they're trying to achieve consensus over a large number of people like that, it makes it very difficult to move forward. If we have people that are actually designing and building these buildings at the table. They understand them, they know what's achievable, they're comfortable with it, they know what it takes to get there. For someone who's never done it, doesn't quite understand it, it's challenging. So the output from these sorts of processes has been so far quite disappointing. And the outcomes that will be achieved simply aren't aligned with the high level policy goals. And so that's an issue that Passive House Canada and other organizations like Efficiency Canada are engaged with to help people understand. Some of it is pretty technical and nerdy for most people, of course, building codes are, but to help regulators, policymakers understand that gap and what can be done to cure that. The other thing within government, I mean, the federal government and every provincial government, they each have typically 3 ministries with various responsibilities relating to buildings. You know, you got one ministry does the building code, another ministry does the policy, a third ministry might do climate change, or in the federal government case, it's the NRC doing building codes. So you've got all these various ministries and innumerable policies and programs and procurement strategies and so on. What we don't see is coordination and focus. The government has the spending power to transform a significant portion of the market. If they were to say, with all of the money they sprinkle around, that if they're investing public money, they want to see buildings that achieve these public goals, the end state that we need to achieve. And so even if they were contributing, we mentioned the $2 billion for deep energy retrofits, the federal government won't be paying the full cost of a retrofit. You know, maybe they chip in 10%. So, I don't have no idea what the percentage will be, but it'll be a small fraction of the total project cost. And if they were to say that public money will only be invested in these buildings, we would see the number of these buildings go up dramatically. That is happening with some programs, and you're seeing public investment in buildings that do deliver these outcomes, but the uniformity of that isn't there. And so that's another thing that we would like to see, is that sort of clear vision and leadership, having everybody understand where we're going, how long we've got to get there, and what some of the basic steps are. That would impact the code as well. It appears in the code process that it's not being developed in a way that recognizes where we need to go.
Or in other words, the code process doesn't seem to have the sense of urgency and mission that the climate commitments would require. Would that be a way of putting it?
That's exactly right, Al. That's a very good way to put it. And ultimately, climate is one of the largest, in some cases, the largest issue for Canadians. It's very high profile politically. We've got a virus at the moment taking an awful lot of the headlines, but we will address that. Climate change is not going away. The need to address it is only going to escalate, and our elected officials will be held accountable for that. I believe they know that. They say that. They recognize it explicitly. And so, we're hopeful that the code process and some of these other wrinkles can be brought back on track. It's hard to fault the process that's been followed so far. I mean, we have this process, but we can't generate the results we need or the outcomes we need by doing the same things we've done before. I said that in terms of, window technical standards and so on. The same thing applies for code development. There's a climate emergency, and we need to change some of our practices in order to get where we need to go.
So from the perspective of a climate emergency, which, we may not have unanimous agreement, in Canada that we're in a climate emergency, but I think there's substantial consensus that we are. An emergency calls for transformational change. In some ways we've looked to I guess countries like Europe as being the leaders of transformational change, but globally today in terms of transformational change in the construction industry, in terms of meaningful efforts to tackle climate change, where would you say the greatest advancements are being made? Where's the greatest innovation, perhaps, or deployment of measures to achieve transformational change?
Well, you see little examples all over, but frankly, the biggest push we're seeing, the most rapid scaling up, is in China.
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 And how? Tell us more about that.
Well, they have made a decision. Of course, government decision making in China is a little more straightforward than it is here, and they have they have set up their goals. They've really just adopted Passive House and put it in there.
Have they?
Yes, and so they start by using the Passive House certification process as a quality assurance process, so they can bring their teams, build the capacity, and get it up to speed. But they are building projects there that are over 1 million square meters in one project.
Wow.
So 10 to 15 million square feet is a whole series of towers. They're building a community, just boom. And it's all certified Passive House. So they're ramping up their industry in the same way as China does. So they're building at a scale that Europe has never seen. They hired the best designers they could identify out of Europe and put them to work. And now they're going from there. They've digested that. And now they are developing systems and technologies that Europe does not have, whether it be in mechanical systems or in windows. And so you can now look to China for some of the most advanced processes. One example I heard of, and again, I'm not a window person at all. Perhaps the listeners here would say, oh, Rob, that's old hat. But there's a large window manufacturer. They're set up to manufacture at scale. And what they did is they came up with a window design that would work for Passive House. But of course, Passive House in Vancouver, Victoria is very different than Passive House in Yellowknife. And you have to achieve the same outcomes, which means you need a much better window in Yellowknife than you do in warmer climates. So they've got the same basic design that they can manufacture in different ways to change its thermal performance. And then it becomes very easy for them to crank out windows that are targeting different climates depending on the demand they've got. Now, these companies are setting up distribution in Canada, and it's coming. And China is also doing a lot with prefabricated buildings. They're delivering whole buildings to North America. Anchorage just got a $60 million, I think it was a 12-story conference hotel downtown Anchorage. It was delivered with the furniture installed and the art on the walls. And, there's not a lot of work for the locals and that kind of thing. So, and I was invited to speak last year at a conference in China. It was a prefabricated Passive House buildings conference. They had an entire conference for prefabricated Passive House buildings. So the scale, this pace, is something that we haven't seen. And that's one of the issues for Passive House Canada is that we would really like to see domestic capacity ramp up. So how, if we are slow about our standards or loose about them and just say, well, this is good enough, how do we then compete in the international market when the competitors are coming in with these really excellent products that are produced at scale? It's worth, we believe, taking a look at what is our competitive advantage. How do we do that? How do we develop our reputation, our brand for having the best fenestration products in the world and enable us to export rather than trying to just defend a shrinking domestic market? Again, I'm not in the fenestration business, but I've heard in Western Canada, Al, you can correct me here, that already the majority of commercial glazing is coming from Asia, not just China, but from Asia. But whatever it is, it's a big slice of the market.
Yes, especially the high-rise towers are mostly built overseas and imported here. And correct.
So how do we turn that around? It can't be impossible, but it's cool. And this may be our opportunity. If we can harness the opportunities that can arise from a government focus on this, and we can perhaps set our industry up in a way that we can not only survive, but we can prosper and give our companies a competitive edge. Because if companies were to come forward, or an industry association come forward and say, we want to do this and we want to make our products the best in the world, that's a message that'll resonate. I've met with the trade people in Ottawa, where we look at developing trade trips to other countries. That is a message that resonates. It's a message that they can support. And it's better yet, it's a funding envelope that is independent of the other funding envelopes we've been talking about.
Well, and I think if I certainly have total confidence that with the market demand for products at this level, Canadian industry can produce them. There's no doubt that we have the capacity and the know-how. What we've lacked is really the market conditions, the demand, to do this. And I suppose this is actually where, as you said, government funding could be intelligently deployed to actually create domestic demand for our industry to do what we know how to do. We just need we're just going to need buyers for these products, and until there's a context where there's actually a market for these products, there's going to be limited funds devoted to developing them. But the
absolutely
ability to do it, we have. And so, I personally would very much like to see us, have our made in Canada solutions to these issues, to tackling the climate emergency, to tackling the technologies that we need to successfully make a dent in that issue. I believe we should really need to make sure that we do it at home and not have others do it for us, and essentially lose the future market to overseas competitors. So very much, I think, I'm certainly hoping that our governments will be more capable in doing what they can to stimulate the buildings sector in Canada in this direction, so that we can be leaders and not laggards in this area. So
this main strategy of the federal government, it's clean growth and climate change. The two are linked. And so it's economic development addressing climate change. This is what we're talking about. As I understand it, Canadian Windows have a good brand, a good reputation relative to those from south of the line. We're positioned reasonably well. And if we can get on this, get the head start and have our market that can help drive some of this innovation, that would be of great assistance.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up our talk today, but thank you, Rob, for being on Tech Talks. Thank you for sharing with us, your journey, your learnings, your experiences, and your perspective, as a leader in this area. Thank you for taking the time to be on our show, and we're very happy that you could, share your thoughts so freely. And I'm hoping that our members and all viewers of Fenestration Canada programming on the YouTube channel will have found this chat interesting, and we'll continue looking both at the future and at some progress in these areas in the coming years. So,
all right. Thank you very much, Al. It's been a real pleasure. So, good luck with the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you.
So thanks, everyone. I just want to mention, since next week is the official launch of our marketplace by Windor, so it's a little bit what's going to replace Windor this year, because we can't be live, obviously. So, all the tech talks are now going to be broadcast in the platform too, so in the Education Hub. So if you don't have your tickets, now is the time to go get them. And I hope I see you all next week in the marketplace. Thanks, everyone.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye now.
You are a member and want to be part of the live recording of Tech Talks? Easy. Visit fenestrationcanada.ca and sign up for the next show.